Keeping your business healthy in today's marketplace can be a challenging and overwhelming task. From the threat of litigation inside and outside your organization and the inefficiencies that can rob your bottom line as a result of unproven marketing programs, the deck can be stacked against you. To get ahead of these challenges and stay ahead of your competition, the Bottled Business Sense Show provides practical business solutions that uniquely emphasize key legal principles, management techniques, and marketing strategies to protect and ensure the longevity of your business. You'll learn how to implement marketing and protection principles equal to those used by today's most successful corporations. Join your hosts Bill Bernard, Rick Moscoso, and Steve Smith for some high-energy discussion that will inspire you to take control of your business so it can prosper in today's consistently challenging business environment.
Good morning, everyone. Today is Tuesday at 10 a.m. here on the Bottled Business Sense Show. We're in for a treat this morning. But before we get into that, wanted to share with you a very interesting topic about medical marijuana and the workplace. And we have an expert to talk about this today. But before we do that, I want to introduce myself. I'm Rick Moscoso, one of your three co-hosts. And on the other side of the screen there, we have Mr. Steve Smith with Growth Source Coaching and Mr. Bill Bernard with WFB Legal Consulting, Inc. How are you guys doing today, gentlemen?
Doing wonderful. Can't wait to dive into this one.
Yeah, I'm doing fine as well. Thank you, Rick. Although what you didn't clarify is I'm not an expert in participating in the use of marijuana.
Rick, when you said that, I'm thinking he's either talking about me or Bill. It's not me.
Yeah, let's clarify that so we all have our viewers and listeners on the same page here.
I just wanted to see how you were going to respond. That's all.
Yeah, I bet you did.
Lord.
We did a show some time ago on drug testing in the workplace, but I thought it might be apropos to bring our listeners and viewers up to speed on medical marijuana in the workplace because it's becoming more and more prevalent. Really, it's happening more and more.
Well, okay, so I got to ask this because currently, I think we have, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we have 4 states that have legalized it for anytime use. You know, Washington, the most recent one was Oregon, Colorado, which everybody's heard about. And I think, is it Massachusetts or Maine or one of those? There's a state up there in the Northeast that's also done it.
Well,
they don't get a lot of
and not only that, Steve, remember our state just voted it down in the last election. We had it up for review, and it did not pass, which leads me right into the topic that we're going to discuss because we have conflicting laws in the sense that we have the use of medical marijuana and whether it's legal or not, and then we have the California right to privacy and how that plays into the whole thing. So I think what people need to understand at the outset is that federal law says that marijuana is illegal, but they leave it up to the states to regulate the use of medical marijuana because federal law places very few limits on employer testing. So they leave it up to the states to decide whether or not they're going to test people either prior to employment or during employment. And those are two separate issues as well. I just had a client contact me and ask me, are they allowed to give you a test for a drug test prior to actually offering you the job? And the answer is yes. They can make that a condition of employment. So federal law allows the states to regulate the use of marijuana for medical reasons, and of course that then plays into whether or not a right to privacy comes into play.
Okay. All right. So before we get to that, I mean, you think about California, even though we don't have the wholesale use of marijuana like Colorado and Washington and Oregon do, they do have marijuana for medical purposes, which you could argue has gotten very lenient in terms of what ailment you might have to have in order to get a card and be able to purchase. So to me, that's somewhat subversive whether somebody really legitimately needs it or has found a way to get it, they still have to be careful about being viewed as someone who uses it all the time, because it's not the wide open law that some of these other states have. Mm-hmm. So if, as an employer or a business owner, what are your rights in terms of ensuring that people in the workplace aren't under the influence while they're at work?
Well, it's a good question. The first thing you can do...
Hold on, Bill, let's stop for a second and hold that question, Steve. Your mic is really bad.
Mine?
No, Bill's. It's crackling.
Yeah,
Say
Bill.
something. Say something, Bill.
Yeah.
It's that.
There's a lot of static coming out of that thing.
Unplug the bottom, unplug the cord, and then plug it back in. No, not the mic, but the yeah. Now you might have to reselect it in the settings of Google Hangouts. Does the Yeti show up? Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, there you go.
When I tap it,
it's much better.
No, it was a bad connect. Don't tap it anymore. Yeah, it was a bad connection.
Yeah, you said bad connection. Yeah.
All right, so we're gonna start off with Steve's question. I'm going to answer it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, Steve, what employers can do is they may require employees to be drug tested in two ways: prior to employment, as a condition of employment, which partly goes to your question, and if they notice people that are being employed that they have a right to randomly drug test, as long as notice is given equally to all employees and it's not based on race, age, sex, that sort of thing, religion, then they can also test randomly at different times during the job and make a clean slate, if you will, or a drug-less person a condition of employment. So those are two very important ways that they can protect themselves, despite the fact that California has what's called a compassionate use law, meaning that if you have a doctor's written authorization, you are allowed to use medical marijuana. But that doesn't mean that an employer can't make the use of marijuana a condition, or the lack of use of marijuana a condition of employment. So,
okay, all right, so let me throw this one out at you. Because I also recognize that, marijuana has been determined to be an effective treatment for people with certain types of chronic pain for which there's no other method of healing it. Surgery is not an option, drugs aren't an option, but they deal with some measure of pain. Mm-hmm. And so if you have an individual like that, and they walk into a business that allows for drug testing at will, how does that employee square that medical condition with the employer so that both parties know what's going on, and the employee can work and the employer can not stress about somebody that's stoned at work?
Well, that's the point I made earlier where I said that California has a compassionate use law. Guess who's required to have the compassion? The employer. You square it if the employer knows about it and the employer understands it and accepts it. If the employer has made that no marijuana use as a condition of employment, you're out of luck. If an employer has said you can be randomly drug tested during your employment, and if you come up positive, you lose your job, then that person's out of luck. There's also a third way. If the employer has indicated that drug use is prohibited in the workplace or as a condition of employment, that employer can also test, even if he hasn't given all employees proper notice at the time they were hired, if and only if there are objective facts that he can prove that required the drug testing. Something happened in the workplace and you suspect somebody of using drugs. It happens more often than not in our workplaces today in the United States. And that's the toughest part, because you're going to have to come up, the employer, if sued, is going to have to come up with objective facts that would lead a jury to conclude that there was a reasonable suspicion that drugs were being used, and because the employer said no drugs in the workplace, then even without random testing, that person can be terminated.
Okay, so I guess if we're trying to provide equal amounts of stage advice to not only the employer but potential employees, what would your advice be to an employee who has chosen to use some strain of marijuana that provides a pain remedy but doesn't provide the high, so to speak, but to manage pain for which they don't have an alternative for getting rid of? What kind of advice would you give them in terms of seeking a new job? How do you approach that to make sure you get the benefit of the doubt, you get the benefit of this compassion law, but you're also transparent with what's going on?
Well, an interesting question and an interesting balance test, if you will, between California's right to privacy and your desire to be transparent and upfront with your employer. I would say that if the employer does not advise you that testing positive for marijuana is a condition of employment at the time you're hired, if the employer does not tell you that he will randomly drug test during your employment, and if found positive, you'll be terminated. If those things are not mentioned to you, and you're not going to, you have no intention of being stoned on the job while you're working, then I would keep it private and not bring it up. If the employer does mention those things and you're interviewing, and you really want this job, then your other alternative is to be very frank, very honest, and straightforward.
So it's almost like you've got to pick a tact with maybe not having enough information to determine what the outcome is going to be.
Well, you've got to know the law, and you've got to consult with somebody, and you've got to say, okay, I am now a bona fide medical marijuana user. I need this to survive. Well, guess what? Your employer is not required to have you need that in his workplace. He or she has to be compassionate about those facts. But if the employer is not bringing up these things at the interview process, if he's not saying that after the interview when you're hired you're going to be randomly tested, and you don't intend to be stoned on the job, then I would maintain that you go forward and not necessarily discuss it, because there's not going to be any harm or any foul there under that circumstance. But you're going to have to be true to yourself. You're going to have to look in the mirror and say, okay, this is what I know, and this is why we provide this information, Steve, isn't it? Really, because we want employees and employers to recognize what their obligations are, and to make sure that people are aware of what their rights are when they go into a job interview. So it's extremely important, because remember, all of this then ties into potential lawsuits. As you could be sued for an employer violating having random tests without giving proper notice. You could have an employee be fired and be denied workers' compensation benefits if he knowingly violates one of the rules that the employer has indicated they would enforce at the time of the interview process and afterwards for random testing. So all of these things come into play. And each of them owe an obligation to each other, and they have to understand that medical marijuana is more and more frequently used in the workplace, or becoming more and more used, and more people are turning to it, because there have been studies that show that it actually does help many medical problems.
When you're talking about people who use it for medical reasons, you're not talking about people who actually take a break at work and go out and smoke a pipe. Right. You're talking about somebody that might do it early in the morning and know that the effects will last them maybe through most of the day, and so they might be under the influence while at work, but they haven't actually engaged in smoking it at work.
Yes, and here's what you want to know right here. A patient who has a valid prescription may not be prosecuted under state law in California for crimes relating to the use, possession, or even cultivation of marijuana within certain amounts and limits. So therefore, you can even grow this stuff and can't be prosecuted under state law. Now, can federal law come back and try to prosecute you for this? Sure. But many federal law is very lax in the sense that it leaves the enforcement of these medical marijuana situations up to the state. It basically looks the other way, much like the federal government does on the immigration situation we have in this country.
Okay, so Bill, all right, so you're the president of your law firm, and you've got a handful of junior lawyers and legal assistants in your office, and you walk by one of them one day, and you notice on their credenza behind their desk they've got this little hydroponic garden with these little leafy greens growing in it. Does that tip your hand? I mean, do you go in and inquire, or do you just assume that that they're growing lilies or something like that? Well,
there's no employer I know who allows the cultivation of marijuana in the workplace. No. So yeah, that would be a terminable offense, and let's face it. In California, we have an at-will employment situation where you can be fired for any reason, anytime, and you can leave your job at any time for any reason, as long as it's not in violation of your any implied contract, which is the subject of another show, or in violation of your civil rights because of race, color, creed, religion, that sort of thing. Interestingly enough, you now have to face making sure that you enforce as an employer the rules and regulations you have, either in your policy manual, when you sit down and you talk to employees, when you interview them, when you go through this process of random testing, should you have a random testing policy. These are things that you have to do as an employer. You have to be aware of the law. Any employer who starts a business and who's not aware of the specific laws involved in running a business is really being negligent to themselves. They're not operating from an educated standpoint, and that's I can't emphasize enough how detrimental that is to your business. I mean, in your business, Steve, I'm sure you've run into people where you had to counsel employers who run into problems, not necessarily medical marijuana related, but problems that they run into in the workplace, either because they don't have a policy in place or because they didn't check with an attorney, and now they come to you and ask for your help. And I'm sure under certain circumstances you have to then refer them to a lawyer. So I'm sure you. That happens a little more than I'd like.
Many times it's just them inquiring, trying to figure out, okay, here's what's happening. Where do you think I ought to go with it? And of course, the minute it is a financial matter or a legal matter or any other kind of employee matter, like a wage dispute matter or something like that, then yeah, I farm that off to other people that I know do it better. But you're right. I mean, let's face it. California especially, we got more regulation out there than any one person probably is aware of. And so it's just a matter of time before many business owners step in it because they just weren't knowledgeable of it.
Yep. And that's the key. Knowledge is power, I guess, as they used to say. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to have, Rick and I have said this many times on the show, a marketing person, an attorney, and an accountant on your not on your staff, not as employees, but certainly as people that you rely upon for those three critical areas. And this is certainly one of them. And I hope our viewers and listeners have a little bit more of a background now as to what they need to do in the workplace as employers and what employees are obligated to do. From the standpoint of making a choice as to which way they're going to go during the hiring process and afterwards. Make sure you know what your employer's policies are, employees, and make sure, employers, you have a handbook that specifically states what your policies are. Please. Can't emphasize that enough. So, a rather short show today, but I thought it was to the point, and I thought it was an update of a prior show that we needed to get out there.
Cool. Awesome. Well, folks, thank you for being here today. Reach out to us on social media at Bottle Business Sense Show or on Twitter at BB Sense. You can also come to our website at Bottle Business Sense Show and look at past episodes that we have archived for you, as well as if you're interested in being a guest on the show, we welcome your inquiries. Go ahead and send in to bottlebusinesssenseshow@gmail.com. And for the purpose of this show, great topic today. I know we have a lot of interest in this, and I think for the beginning of the new year, we'll have a lot of playbacks on this one for sure. But if somebody wants to take this discussion a little bit further with our legal expert, how do they get a hold of you, Bill?
Well, thanks, Rick. And again, with the disclaimer that the expertise will come in the form of legal analysis and advice, not in how to use marijuana, okay? But there is a article I posted. If you'd like to see exactly what we spoke about today, I did an article on LinkedIn Pulse, so you can go to WFB Legal Consulting on LinkedIn, and you can see this post there. And Rick, maybe you can put that URL tag on the bottom of the show so people can go there. You can find me on LinkedIn and on Twitter, WFBLC, and at WFBLegalConsulting.com. My phone numbers are 949 area code 413-6535 and 698-6222, and I'm happy to entertain any problems or concerns you might have in this area or in the area of business law in general.
Well, great, excellent. Any closing thoughts there, Steve? I see a grin on your face, so I know you're bursting to say something.
I'm all these inappropriate comments are running through my head, so I'm just.
Yeah, we do not advocate the cultivation, possession, or sale of marijuana in any way, shape, or form here on the Bottle Business Sense Show. And do you know that you can now go to there's a website you can go to, and you can go and I believe pay a doctor $60. You can go in, pay that doctor $60. Obviously, insurance won't cover it, and you can get by complaining about various body part issues that you might have, you can get a prescription for medical marijuana. It's becoming easier and easier more than ever now, and that's why the law has remained the way it is, to allow employers to regulate this as a condition of employment, because they know that there's going to be a lot of people who abuse the situation.
Well, hey, Bill, I got to tell you, just as a side note, and this is anecdotal, I have no research to back this up, but it's my opinion that when it comes to things that cause people to engage in risky behavior or accidents or fatalities or things like that, you hear much less about people who might be smoking marijuana and getting into trouble, and you hear about people using cell phones and texting and getting into trouble.
Yeah. No, there's no question about it. It would be nice if the rule of law was followed a little more often, and if people thought of others a little more often. I mean, the first thing I think of when you talk about texting is texting on the highway and getting into an accident because they're texting while they're driving,
Right.
It's very little regard for other people many times, and that's what that's a social thing that we have to learn to be better at, and that gets into parenting, and boy, we want to stay away from that on this show.
Yes.
And that's a topic for another episode.
Yep. Well, I appreciate it, guys. We'll look forward to seeing everybody next week, I guess, and for another marijuana-less show at the Bottle Business Sense Show.
All right, with that, we'll say goodbye to our listeners and viewers out there. We'll see you at the Bottle Business Sense Show. We'll see you later.
Okay,
all right.
Take care. Have
See
a
you guys.
prosperous week,
Take care.
everybody.